Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is Alec Hill. Alec is President Emeritus of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, USA. He served for 14 years as InterVarsity's president and previously was Dean of the School of Business and Economics at Seattle Pacific University. He holds a law degree from the University of Washington and has written for the Huffington Post, Christianity Today, the Aspen Institute, and Patheos. He's the author of a book called Just Business, Christian Ethics in the Marketplace. He lives in Seattle with his wife, Mary. Alec, we're really glad to have you with us here today and appreciate you taking some time to join us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
So as you know, during this whole interview series, we've been just talking about, our reflections on the whole pandemic and what we're going through. So would you like to start by sharing yours?
Yeah, so in 2015, I had a bone marrow transplant. And I want to share three things, then see where you want to go with them, Brian. The first was I was in quarantine for 4 months at a hospital. And then for 8 months, I came home and was sheltered in place, if you will, and exercising social distancing long before. So for me, this feels like a do-over. I've done this. I've lived this before. And I do think some of the insights that I gained during that time can be helpful to others. The second idea is control. I learned what a sense of an illusion of control I had through my cancer, and that I thought I had everything in the palm of my hand, and what the cancer showed me was how little I actually controlled. And I think what's happening with this pandemic is exactly the same thing. There's an existential slap that happens to us, and we wake up and thinking that all these things that are secure, that we controlled, we really didn't control. And the third big idea is what I call the expectation gap. And that is the gap between what reality is and what we want. And when life is humming along, that gap can be narrow. But right now, the expectation gap is pretty wide for people in the pandemic. They want a certain life and quality. They want to return to normal, but the reality isn't that. So I don't know where you want to go with those three big ideas, but I think they all play into this crisis, and they all play into my personal story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's touch on all three of them. I mean, in terms of the first, I think you already shared a couple of the insights, but what else would you say that you learned from that other experience?
Yeah, I'd say the quarantine piece, it's like an elevator that goes down, and you have to adjust to the new floor you're getting off on, because life is not the same. But what I found was, and I'm a flaming extrovert, type A, take the hill kind of person, I've always been busy, is that I did adjust successfully to a very altered lifestyle. I mean, I was traveling 40% of the time, 60-hour weeks, and then all of a sudden with the bone marrow transplant, it stopped. And of course, I was fighting for my life, and so that probably, protected me a little bit from the adjustment. But I actually thrived in that year. As the year went on, and I couldn't do things with people, I was very thankful for technology like this with Zoom, that I was able to engage. So I started mentoring people and coaching them, and then also some of my spiritual disciplines in terms of my solitude, things that I hadn't done very well. My whole life, I was always told solitude, retreats. Well, okay, here they are. And I wrote a piece on this recently that in this sense of in this time of being quiet, there's actually a lot of good things that we can learn and take from them. And the other thing is that sometimes we draw a line from today into perpetuity, thinking, well, my experience today, it feels like it's going to last forever. It won't. My doctors kept telling me, you're going to be in isolation for 4 months and quasi-isolation for another 8 months, but then you will be able to re-enter life, and I have. And likewise with this pandemic, it may take us a year, before we get a vaccine, but this isn't forever. And that's one of the pieces that I want to share with people. This isn't forever.
Well, I think, particularly the stage that you talked about where you were at home under quarantine, after you had recovered from the surgery and everything, that really is pretty analogous, it sounds like, to where we're at right now.
Well, the funny thing, Brian, is that I always compared myself to Waldo, and I'd go out during those 8 months and I'd go for walks, but I had to avoid everybody because I had very little immune system. It was my brother's DNA and his cells that came in, but they weren't mature. So I was like Waldo but now when I go out for walks, everybody's Waldo. and
That's true.
everybody's in red, and we're all avoiding each other. So psychologically, this is weird. I mean, none of us have ever experienced anything like this. I suppose I come the closest, but even this isn't like what I had in 2015.
That's true. When everyone else is just, business as usual and you're not, that's it's a
Well, then
weird feeling.
you can kind of slip through the cracks and people don't notice you, but now everybody's doing it all the time. It's weird when you walk down the street and people get out off the sidewalk into the street to avoid you.
Yeah.
And we did that when I had the bone marrow transplant, but now, of course, it's common practice for everyone. On this issue of control, I think, there's a funny story out of New York City that they had these, you could push a button and the pedestrian lights are supposed to change and you go across. Well, those haven't worked since the 70s, but they're still there. So people are still pushing the buttons as if they control the lights, but they don't. They were disconnected. They were disconnected in the 70s or 80s. So that's, to me, the perfect metaphor of someone who throws the dice harder in a game thinking it's going to get a higher number. And for me, I always thought that I controlled so much more than I did. And so I'm much more humbled now when I talk about the future. The book of James talks about, James says, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. I never said any of that stuff before. And I find it's really funny when I commit to speaking or sharing with someone, I'll say, well, I'll show up if the Lord wills. And of course, they don't like that. But it's better theology, right?
Well, it's true 100% of the time, right? I mean, it's, whether we like to recognize it or not.
No, that's absolutely true. I'm embarrassed. One story from the transplant. So I'm talking to a nurse, and I'm just asking him question after question, and they had told me there's only one avenue, one pathway for you, Mr. Hill. And finally, he took his fist and he slammed it on the desk and he swore and he said, "Are you going to trust us or not?" And I had to realize at that point that I couldn't control that process. So, and there's some ways with this COVID that there's a lot of things going on around us, whether it's our government or the economy or the globe, that we just simply can't control. So what do we do with that? And there's a sense of the sovereignty of God. How do we lean into that and not become passive? We don't want to become passive and exercise no control. But appropriate control is in the middle between over control and under control. And I'm still learning how to do that well. And I suspect right now a lot of people are learning about that.
Well, who was the one that, said the famous quote about, give me the wisdom to control what I can? And
St. Francis, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm not,
You paraphrase. We all know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly.
It's called the Serenity Prayer.
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, how true, right? I mean, no wonder it's, withstood that many years of people saying it, because having that kind of wisdom is essential, and even showing itself more so now.
You mentioned my first book, the ethics book, but the second book that I just wrote it's called Living in Bonus Time, and it's about surviving cancer. And when I wrote it, it just came out in January of this year. I had no idea that so many of the lessons that applied to a cancer survivor were going to apply to COVID. And so, depending on others, being resilient, being hopeful, looking for wonder, all of these are chapters in the book. And it now, as I go, what happened with this book is it helped me sort of it was therapeutic. It was therapeutic for me to write out and to sort of get my arms around, like one of the chapters is on identity. Who am I now? So, I'm a different person than I don't have the same capabilities. Now, I don't know how exactly that applies to COVID. It'll be interesting to see what the identity issues are. It's all going to be individualized, of course. But who am I now is a big question. Now, for people who are losing their jobs or, their spouses, they're having big identity issues. And I do think in the next 6 to 12 months, the identity issues will really start to surface as we deal with the physical issues now. How do we eat? How do we pay our bills? And then the next question is, who am I in light of my reduced role or my and that's coming.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry I forgot to mention that new book, but I'll make sure that I put it in the notes, that go with the recording here.
Okay.
So the third area you mentioned was expectations, the gap on expectations. You want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so let me use cancer first and then the pandemic. So the cancer, first of all, is, I had certain mental, so I had chemo brain that was extreme, and I couldn't even, for a couple months, I couldn't even complete sentences. And that's one expectation gap. Another expectation gap would just be physically being able to lift things or move things. Um, and I think with COVID, this sense of what we've expected to be normal and what is now the new normal, that's the expectation gap. And life is full of disappointments. We see it in our marriages, we see it in our work. People never measure up to what we hope they will be, right? So either we have to decrease our expectations or we have to increase the reality. Well, I think in this COVID crisis, it's going to be hard to increase reality that much for a while here. So we're going to have to decrease our expectations. And one of the most interesting stories I think of is the Apostle Paul, who's 100 miles an hour, and all of a sudden he's arrested by the Romans. And he writes this marvelous letter to the Philippians where he says, I'm content in any circumstance. I've learned to have a lot, I've learned to have little. Somehow Paul found the secret to dealing with the expectation gap much better than I have. But I think I'm better at it now than I was 5 years ago because of the cancer piece. But I think it's a very helpful sort of rubric to think about, are my expectations too high or is my reality too low? And I can try to move those lines towards each other. My guess is as Americans, because we've had it so good for so long, our expectations may not be realistic going forward.
Well, there's a couple of additional expectation gap elements that, you're talking makes me think of. One is kind of like expectations about the dangerousness of this disease, right? Because it's clear that has varied a lot in our country.
Yes.
And initially, I think everyone was taking it a little bit too lightly. Then a lot of people now, have taken it very seriously, but there are some people that really just still don't. Even it was last weekend, I think, when we were out doing a little bit of a drive, we went over by the ocean, and we had thought that all of the boardwalks were closed in New Jersey, and the town that we were driving through, it wasn't. And there were a lot of people walking around without masks on, relatively close to each other. So, which I was really surprised at, because since this is another hotspot, that's not what most people are doing. So, there's that kind of expectation. I think that's an interesting one. And then also, everybody kind of thinking about, what are we going to learn out of all of this? And how is our society going to change? And I think, you've talked about, kind of diminished expectations. That's going to be true for, a lot by necessity, right? But then, there's a lot of us too that I think that are kind of hopeful, that there'll be some really good things that come out of this. And so I've got expectations around that I don't know are justified or not. But, what are your thoughts on those two dimensions of expectations?
Well, crises really bring out who we are, don't they? I mean, we can be cruising along thinking we are just wonderful people with great character, and then all of a sudden we get into a crisis situation and we're kind of jerkish. We're mean, we're impatient, and we look at ourselves and go, am I really that way? And so crisis displays our character. And there are moments when I don't like my reactions and I don't like who I am. I do think back to your early comment about on a continuum, there are some people who lean towards risk and some people lean towards caution. And stereotypically, the cautious people become actuaries and accountants, and the risk takers become entrepreneurs and jet pilots, right? So the reaction to this crisis, you see the whole spectrum, and you just see people who want to put a deadbolt on the door and only want to go shopping every 14 days, and they're just locked down. And I would say to them, you're probably too risk adverse, you're probably too cautious. But the crazy jet pilot over here, or fighter pilot, who just loves risk and doesn't wear the mask and does what you're saying and goes to hotspots, clearly, that's not a helpful thing for you. And it's also pretty selfish because it's going to hurt other people as well. So I think, if the cautious people can push their boundaries and if the risk-driven people can push their boundaries, the problem we live in America where everybody insists on their own rights, I'm a lawyer, and this sense of I have my rights, and how dare you tell me what we're doing. Now, let me say this, though. I've actually been quite impressed. I actually think the social fiber has been stronger in the United States during this time than I expected. So we see the protesters going out there and doing things, but actually the solid, vast majority of Americans are both being really careful with other people and sensitive to the long-term consequences. So
I sense the same thing.
I do. And so David Brooks has talked a lot about this in some of his articles. And I have been more, now we'll see if it goes on for another 3, 4, 6 months, how that goes. But to me, it's very hopeful what I'm seeing. So the expectation is, so if I have this expectation I can do whatever I want and I'm not able to do it, then the gap gets wider. On the other hand, if I lower my expectation, saying, okay, I'm sacrificing for the team, I'm not going to have as much fun, but it's for the good, then I've lowered my expectation, the gap is much less, and I'm a happier person. We had an example the other day. My wife and I went for our morning walk, and we saw these kids, maybe 8 and 10, standing on top of a pickup truck in the back, and they're waving up, and I look up and there's grandma and grandpa waving out the window. It's very sweet. That's the good side. We come around the corner and there's this BMW who cuts out in front of another car illegally, and my wife tells him to slow down. He then drove around this big block and found us and rolled down his window. It's probably 45 years old, and he starts yelling at my wife. And so within a short period of time on a very simple walk, we saw the best and the worst. And I'll tell you, I really want to be like the best. And we prayed for that guy because we thought he's going to go home and hit somebody in his family. And what an awful, awful attitude he had.
Wow. Well, just to share a couple of, while we're on this whole expectations thing, a couple of things I'm hopeful about that, society-wise. One is this recognition that we're all in this together, right? Everyone's connected. I mean, that's kind of hitting home globally, right? I mean, that's hitting home a little bit harder than what has typically been the case. Even though, it's hard for a lot of people that haven't been out of the United States and seen some of the poverty in some of the other countries that at least I know I have. It's hard, I think, for a lot of Americans to really understand that, and that these people are still humans and they're still, trying for their children just as much as anyone else. So I'm kind of hopeful that there's a little bit more of a unity, understanding. And the second thing I'm hopeful about is empathy. We probably have taken hospital workers as an example for granted, right? And now it's just so in our face about what they're going through that I'm hopeful that, there'll be a greater sense of empathy for that, for people that lose their jobs, for, all the kinds of things that are really tough that are caused by this whole experience. I mean, what do you think?
Well, first of all, with healthcare workers, I had 87 days of infusion in a row. So my heroes, the people I love, are my nurses who cared for me, the doctors. And so I do agree with you. I mean, there's a shortage of oncology nurses even before the pandemic, because who wants to go into oncology and watch your patients die? But those people who do that are my heroes. Matter of fact, I dedicate my book to them. I think to imagine going.
Most of us not had your experience.
Well,
you know what I mean? So it's not as real to all of us as it is to you.
I mean, in my cohort, half of us died, and so you're a nurse and you form an attachment with someone who you see for like my case, 87 straight days, 4 hours a day of infusion, right? And you grow to care for them and love them, then they die. And so how do you recover from that? And so to me, the healthcare people are the most amazing.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what they do.
I can't. Now, on the global poverty, this is an area of concern for me. Usually when I post a Facebook message, I'll get 50 to 100 sort of reactions, responses. I posted an article about the impact of the coronavirus on Africa out of the Washington Post, and I got 9 responses.
Really?
Yeah, and
wow.
sometimes people don't want to read full articles. I get that. But I think we've been so focused on our own stuff and America's problems that we realize if you're in Kenya, you can't go off and get $1 trillion or two and pump it into the economy. And what's happening in some of these countries is going to be absolutely devastating. All the millions of people who moved out of the $2 a day or less category are now slipping back into that. And it's a tremendous tragedy. It reminds me when I went to law school, I had a professor, and he used this illustration, which I've never forgotten. And that's the difference between billiard balls and planets. So if we think that the only impact we have on people is like billiard balls, that when we smack into each other, then that's one model of thinking about community. But there's really no community there. It's just that if we hit each other, but other than that, there's no connection. But his analogy was, no, we're more like a solar system where planets operate independently, but there's gravity and there's pull and there's impact. And so I think, I go back to what you said, I'm paraphrasing what you said, I think in this time, we're realizing that we're more like a planetary system and that we all connect. And even though we look independent, we really are dependent on each other. And
that's really a great analogy. I never heard that planetary story before.
No, it was a torts class, which is not what you'd expect. but this guy was amazing. He went on to become the president of the University of Texas, Bill Powers. It was a great illustration, and I know it was original. But I thought about that, and that I am a communitarian person. I live not only in the community. Who's my neighbor? That's the fundamental question. And those oncology nurses, I was their neighbor, and I want my 94-year-old neighbor in my condo. I'm his neighbor, and so I want to be a good neighbor, but my neighbor is broader, and that's the gift of technology, right? Because I'm in conversations with people in different parts of the world, and it's a gift to me, but I think I can be a gift to them.
Very cool. So another thing we've been talking about, on this interview series is, how God has helped us through challenging times in the past. And you've shared some about your, bone marrow transplant. What are your thoughts on that whole topic?
Yeah, when I did my research for the book, I found a term that just really spoke to me. It was called an existential slap. And an existential slap is when you can define your life before it happened and after it happened. So for me, cancer was an existential slap. For some people, it's a divorce or a death. And I think this pandemic, for many people, is an existential slap. And so what do we do with who is God when we're in the middle of an existential slap? Where is he? And one of the things that I found in my research, which I thought was unique to me, is that it's more common than not that people in their deepest pain experience the deepest presence of God. I had 23 days where I had no white cell counts, and we didn't know for 40 days if I'd live or die. And during that time, I felt this liminal sense of God's presence in a way that was unique. I felt like he was actually preparing me for death. So that's a little more dramatic than what we're facing right now with the pandemic, but I want to encourage people that the paradox of God seems to draw closest, or we draw closer to him is probably a better way to put it, in these hard times than we do when we're just coasting. And so look for him. And there is something called the dark night of the soul. There's lament, there's loss, there's a sense of separation. But historically, if you read church history, there's a greater sense of God's presence in times of plague and death and war than in normal times. And it doesn't make sense. Okay, it is a paradox. But I'm just testifying to it in my own life that the Lord really touched me every day in very special ways, both in my interactions with people, but mostly alone. And that was a surprise. It was a surprise to the degree that it happened.
Well, I read, the other day about like how many Google searches for the word prayer, other things like that have, gone so much higher, over the past month or two. So it's a little bit similar to what you're saying. It's like, people are actually paying attention, just things that they sometimes don't pay attention to.
Well, think of the huge disequilibrium in our lives right now. I mean, I'm a baseball fanatic. I love my Seattle Mariners, worst team in baseball history. And I miss that diversion. I miss the fun of watching a baseball game with my daughter and reading the sports page. But what does that do then? Well, it takes away a diversion, which is I think baseball is God's gift to us. But having said that, it also can become something that we do. And when we get so many of these diversions, we miss the main thing. So for me, this is a season where being stripped of so many things that we would normally love to do. And it's an opportunity to go into do some soul work, to think, okay, who am I before God, before humanity? And that's not a place that a lot of people feel comfortable, excited about going. But I just, again, want to say from my experience was, because I had to go there in my year of isolation, it was rich. Yeah. So in the time of my greatest physical pain and psychological, am I going to live kind of time, I felt surrounded. I felt a warm embrace of God's arms, and it changed me. It made me a better person. So my prayer for COVID is that even though it's uncomfortable to have this disequilibrium, that others will experience something similar to that. And I think that's going to happen. I mean, it's not universal. It's not everybody, but I think for people who are looking, the last chapter in my book is on wonder. And I talk about one of the advantages of, okay, pain is horrible, suffering's horrible, it's manure. And but in this compost pile of new growth, which is both the good things in life and the manure, comes new growth. And so wonder is one of those things where if we look for wonder in the midst of dark times, we begin to see, not only in creation, but in hearing a baby laugh, in listening to music, our sense of appreciation for it goes up so much higher. I mean, a very tacky example, I couldn't have teriyaki chicken for a year, and I love teriyaki chicken. When I had my first bite of teriyaki chicken, it was really good. So my hope is that for most people, that going through this hard time will accentuate the really important things in life, and they will sound better, taste better, feel better, and the spiritual side of their lives will have grown.
Well, I hope that does bring some growth for us.
I do, but I'm not trying to sugarcoat the pain, because pain sucks. There's not, pain is not redemptive, but pain can be redeemed. There's an interesting science called post-traumatic growth, which I'd never heard of before. It comes out of the University of North Carolina, and basically it says that when people have traumatic events in their life, 1/3 later say they grew significantly from it, another third will say they grew moderately, and a third will say no growth or regression. So the remarkable thing is that 2/3 of people who go through trauma say that pain is not the end of the story. PTSD is not the end of the story. And by the way, I did have PTSD coming out of my cancer. And so the good news is that our pain is not the final word. That's the good news. And so this season is not the final word.
Wow.
That's cool. So hope and gratitude and humility, all those things, if we lean into them, I think God gives them to us.
That would make for some good reading, I think, too, on that topic, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So I also want to give a shout out to caregivers. When I started writing this book, it was primarily for cancer survivors. But what I realized is that the heroes, the unsung heroes, were people, the caregivers. So I know in this pandemic, there are a lot of people who are caring for others who can't fully take care of themselves. They can't go to the store. They can't go out. So thank you. I feel for caregivers. There are resources for caregivers. And I think that don't be a hero, but seek some, but I think, again, like oncology nurses, caregivers are the unsung heroes of my life and of this pandemic.
Well, hopefully more and more people are realizing that in these days.
That's right. That's right.
So what about any kind of resources, books, spiritual practices, anything that you have to suggest to people for these times?
Yeah, so I've got show and tell here. I've got some books lined up here for you. The first is Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. It was a New York Times bestseller 5-10 years ago. And he's a doctor, I think in New York. And it's a brilliant book about how we face mortality. And this is the existential slap book. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, how do we deal with this sense of being human and not being eternal in the sense in these bodies? Second book is A Friend of Yours, The Attentive Life by Leighton Ford, who's my mentor. I talk to him monthly. And this is a book about slowing down and thinking through and paying attention to those around us and to God and not being in such a rush. Leighton, in his first 50 years, was in a great rush. His son died of a heart problem at age 21, and Leighton changed his whole course of his life and started writing books like this. It's a gem. I mentioned Wonder, and this is called Wonderstruck by Margaret Feinberg. It's a great book. I used it a lot in my last chapter in the book, and she talks about finding wonder in small things in surprising places. And then I'm almost done. Upside by Jim Rendon is on post-traumatic growth. And I found this to be fascinating. His father was a Holocaust survivor. And he talked about how his father would handle crises that was so calming for everyone around him because he'd been through so much worse. And the final book, which is a shameless plug, is my book.
Good.
Living in Bonus Time. And a number of the themes that we've been talking about here are covered in the book. And again, it came out in January. I had no idea that so many of the themes would be so relevant to the virus, to the time we're living.
Excellent.
Well, thanks, Brian.
Well, Alec, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been wonderful to spend some time together. We haven't known each other very long, so I'm really very glad to be able to spend time getting to know you and talking with you about some of these important topics.
Well, I think what you're doing really counts, and I hope that people find solace from me and from other people who may have been thinking or experiencing this in other realms. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.